Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters. Welcome back to the Divine Reality course. We are continuing with the Quranic argument for God's existence. And the last session we left off on the ayat from the Quran found in chapter 52, verses 35 and 36, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, or were they created by nothing, or were they the creators of themselves, or did they create the heavens and the earth, but rather they are not certain. And as we discussed, that these ayat, even if we look at it from the perspective that Allah is asking us some powerful rhetorical questions about our existence, our origins, we can derive from these rhetorical questions more direct questions and ask these questions about anything that began to exist. So although the verses refer specifically to human beings, it can also be applied, these questions can be applied to anything that begins to exist. Khuliku means they were created, made, or originated. So like I said, these questions that emerge are extracted from these two ayat of the Quran can be applied to anything that begins to exist. In other words, can be applied to anything and everything besides Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala himself. Now, the first thing I want to do is I want us to engage on that initial level, in the way that Allah is directly asking us these questions. So I want us to think about this, and it's very powerful, especially from the perspective of awakening the fitrah, triggering the fitrah, humbling us as human beings. Because Allah says, and let's think about the first one, Allah says, were they created by nothing? And I want us to ask ourselves this question: can we come from nothing? As soon as Allah asks us this question, could I be created by nothing? Could I come from nothing? Think about that for a second. And you will realize the answer is no. Out of nothing, nothing comes. It's very intuitive, it's very rational, it's a principle. If there is nothing, then you're not going to get anything. Meaning, and ourselves, we cannot come from nothing. We didn't come from nothing. Even on a sort of material level where our parents had to exist for us to come into existence, and their parents had to exist for them to come into existence. And that goes back all the way, and it has to be an origin point, because you can't have an infinite regress of causes, as we discussed in the argument from dependency, and we'll touch upon again in this particular argument. So we can't come from nothing. I couldn't come from nothing. And then Allah says, and Allah takes it up another notch. So coming from nothing is an impossibility. You can cross that out. And then Allah takes it up another step. Or were they the creators of themselves? Could we create ourselves? That's an absurdity. That's an absurdity. Even on a very simple intellectual level, that's an absurdity. How can one create themselves? Can you give birth to yourself? How would that work? It doesn't make any sense. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, were they the creators of the heavens and the earth? Now this is something very powerful that takes place at this point. Very, very powerful. And that is that up until verse 36 and verse 35, the two questions Allah has asked us are to do with our own existence. So the focus is inward. The focus is on ourselves. Can I come from nothing? We're thinking about ourselves. Can I create myself? We're thinking about ourselves. But then there is this very powerful and heavy shift that takes place. We're thinking about ourselves. I can't come from nothing. I can't create myself. That's humbling in itself. But then Allah says, or were you the creator of the heavens and the earth? Can you create this entire cosmos that you see around you? You can't make sense of your own existence, our own futile existence. How are you going to make sense of this entire universe and this cosmos, which is in ways far greater than us and existed prior to us? How are you going to make sense of this? How are you going to make sense of this entire universe? That just really humbles you. Really just humbles you as a human being. I can't make sense of my own very existence. And now Allah is asking me, did I create the heavens and the earth? SubhanAllah. It just makes you blush in a way. It really pulls at the strings of the fitrah. It really awakens and triggers the fitrah within each person, if we really sit and reflect upon these ayat as we should do. And then Allah concludes by saying, but rather they are not certain, or that they don't want to be certain. And this is an apt, He couldn't have a better ending to these ayat. Whenever we deny the fact that Allah exists, that He is our creator, He created the entire heavens and the earth, He created us, when we deny this reality, we just don't want to be certain for one reason or the other. So just reflecting upon these ayat, brothers and sisters, on a very simple, intuitive level, on a level that every human can engage on, really has such a deep and profound impact, in and of itself. But now we're going to look at the more deeper level, where we reflect upon these ayat and we derive a very powerful logical argument from these ayat, inshallah. Now, like I said, as the scholars, the exegetes have mentioned, that these logical possibilities or these questions that emerge from these ayat, something coming from nothing, something creating itself, something creating something else, which obviously by extension is created. These possibilities can be applied to anything that begins to exist. In other words, therefore, these possibilities can apply to the universe. Now, before we apply them to the universe and for this argument to work, we have to first sort of have a look at briefly or answer the question, did the universe begin to exist? Because there are some people out there who claim or challenge the world or say that the universe is eternal. The universe has always existed. Now, this is a problematic notion, especially when we reflect back upon the argument from causality, the argument from contingency or dependency. We can very quickly come to the conclusion that the universe and everything that we perceive has an origin point, began to exist, came into existence. Why? And I want you to just think about this for a second before I give you the answer. Reflect back upon the argument from dependency and contingency. Why must the universe have a beginning point philosophically, even based upon some of the points we reflected upon from the argument from dependency? Think about it for a second, and if you reflect upon it, you'll come to the realization again, inshallah, which is that, well, because the universe is dependent. The universe has limited physical qualities. It has fundamental base building blocks which could have been arranged in any other way. Right? So if this is the case, if the universe is dependent, then it means that it requires upon a necessary being outside of itself. And dependent things aren't eternal. Dependent things have an origin point, have a beginning. The universe and everything that we perceive, including the fundamental building blocks, have limited physical qualities. Things with limited physical qualities are finite. Finite things have a beginning, right? So it's very simple from a philosophical perspective, logical perspective, to conclude that our universe had a beginning. Our universe is not infinite or eternal or necessary. Now, another point to reflect upon is that the actual infinite doesn't exist in the real world, right? This is a very important point as well, and I'm going to give you some thought experiments to really help us understand this particular point, because we talk about the infinite, we conceive out or think about or reflect upon the concept of the infinite, but the actual infinite doesn't exist in the real world. The actualized differentiated infinite does not exist. An undifferentiated infinite does exist, meaning the infinite made up of discrete physical parts doesn't exist within our known physical material reality. The undifferentiated infinite is coherent and can exist. This is an infinite not made up of physical parts. So within certain disciplines such as mathematics, you can have what you can refer to as the undifferentiated infinite that you can work with. However, within the real world, an actual infinite does not exist. Now, I'll give you guys a quick thought experiment, if you like. Imagine we have a bag, okay? Now, in that bag, we have an infinite number of balls. There's an infinite number of balls in this bag. Now, say I come along and I take out 5 balls from this bag that contains infinite number of balls. I've removed 5 balls from this bag. How many balls left? Think about that for a second. How many balls left? There's an infinite number of balls in this bag, and I've removed 5 balls from this bag. How many balls are remaining? Well, that doesn't really make sense, because if it's an infinite number, well, it's still infinity. It's an infinite number. But something has to change because I've removed 5. Well, how do we make sense of this now? You can't, because again, it highlights that the infinite doesn't exist in the real world, and an actualized, differentiated infinite does not exist. And therefore the universe cannot be infinite, because the universe is physical, it's material. So I'll give you another. Let's think of it from this perspective, just so we can really derive the point home. Imagine, again, we have a bag, and you have an infinite number of balls in this bag. But this time, I don't come along and remove 5 balls. This time I come along and I add 2 balls. I add 2 balls to the infinite number of balls. How many balls? Well, it's infinite. But again, something has to be different because I've added 2. But it's not. So again, it just doesn't make any sense, right? So this example highlights in a very simple way that the actualized, differentiated infinite does not exist in the real world, and therefore the universe, again, could not be infinite. Here is another very sort of simple example, again, taking from the argument for dependency. And one of the beautiful things about this course is that as we progress through the course, some of the principles and ideas that we cover in previous arguments and sections, you can derive them and apply them to the other sections too. So going back to the argument for contingency and dependency, things with limited physical qualities do not give rise to their own limitations. There must have been an external cause, explanation, set of factors that gave rise to the limitations. Therefore, they are finite and had a beginning. Just to reiterate that point again that we made, and I'll give you a quick analogy. If there was, imagine, a rock in the middle of this table, or floating in the air right now, a rock, right? We've all seen rocks. And if I said to you that this rock is eternal, it's infinite, it has no beginning, it has no end, what would you, looking at this rock and observing this rock, just even intuitively, would you buy that explanation? The answer is no. Why? What's going on inside our heads which is leading us to this conclusion? Well, it's that when we look at this rock, immediately we pick up on the fact that, well, it has limited physical qualities. It's a certain size, it's a certain shape, it has a certain color, it has certain crevices, it has a certain density. And we also pick up on the fact that its fundamental building blocks could have been arranged in many other ways. So the particular the particular rock that we see in front of us has, limited or fundamental building blocks, which you could say are atoms or quarks or wherever you want to go with that. Whatever those fundamental building blocks are, they are arranged in a particular way, which give the rock a certain appearance, certain dimensions. Now, those fundamental building blocks could have been arranged in many, many, many different ways. But if it's arranged in this particular way, then there's something outside of the rock which gave rise to this specific arrangement and these specific limitations. And all of these things lead us to conclude, well, the rock is therefore not infinite or eternal. It has an origin point, it has a beginning point, and something outside of itself brought itself into existence. In the same way, the same applies to the universe. Just take the rock and expand it out to the size of the universe. The same questions apply. The same observations are to be made. The same conclusion, we arrive at the very same conclusion. Now, this is some ways philosophically you can highlight and clarify that the universe began to exist. And by the way, most people out there acknowledge or assume or believe that the universe has an origin point, that the universe began to exist, came into existence. Some people may argue against this notion. Some people may claim that the universe is eternal, and in those cases you can use these philosophical examples to highlight that the universe is not eternal and is not infinite and has a beginning. Now, you may have noticed that I didn't go into some of the scientific evidence that is there to support the notion that the universe has a beginning. Although there is some supporting evidence, such as the redshift and the fact that the universe is expanding out and so on. However, I don't think it's a good or great idea to use this. You may want to use the scientific evidence as supporting evidence, but I would probably refrain from doing that. And the simple reason is because within the sphere of science, even when it comes to the origins of the universe, there's around 17 different models that explain the data, right? Big Bang is just one of those models. So, I mean, if you bring that into play, then someone else may bring one of the other models and other ways of interpreting the data, and you will get into this, you know, unnecessary discussion, which will take you away from where we're trying to go with this particular argument. So that being said, hopefully that's clear. And when you guys are ready, inshallah, we'll move on to the next section where we'll now start to break down the logical form of this argument and look into it in more detail.